Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I just got back from spending about a week with my in-laws and my hubby in Ohio, so that was fun. It was not as humid as it has been for most of the summer, for which I was extremely grateful. Still humid enough that I had really, really dumb hair for a week, but yeah, I don't have curly hair unless it's humid, and then it's not attractive curly. But that's neither here nor there. I was thinking about reading and traveling and airports, and I always have a book with me when I travel. I always have a book with me wherever I go, I've mentioned before. But then when I see other people traveling and reading, I always try to see what they're reading, whether that's the cover of their book or if they're reading on, if they're reading an ebook. I try to kind of peek nonchalantly over their shoulder at their book. I'm like a total book stalker, creeper, whatever you want. And I think I'm being subtle, but I bet I'm not. I bet people are like, what in the world is that woman doing? And were I more extroverted like my husband, I would probably just strike up a conversation and talk to them about their books, but I'm not. So I'm just that creepy woman in the airport. If you've been recently book stalked, that may have been me in an airport. Yeah. So at any rate, I was reading several of the books that I'll be discussing with authors for the next couple of interviews. One of which is today's interview with author D.A. Bartley about her new book, Death in the Covenant. This is part of a series, the Abish Taylor Mystery series, and this is the second in that series. Let me go ahead and give you the description. Detective Abbie Taylor returned to the mountain town of Pleasant View, Utah, hoping for a quiet life. But that hope dissipates when she wakes to an unsettling phone call. Arriving at the scene of a fatal car accident, she discovers that the victim was one of the most beloved leaders of the church and an old family friend. Abbie is skeptical when her father insists the death was not an accident, but in an attempt to patch up their relationship, she takes a few days off from her job as the sole detective in the police department and heads to Colonia Juarez, a former LDS colony in Mexico. There, she uncovers a plan harkening back to the church's history of polygamy. But Abbie knows too well that bringing secrets to light can be deadly. When she returns to the States, some members of the LDS community certainly don't seem happy that Abbie knows what she knows. Abbie realizes with a jolt that her investigation could cost her father his job and possibly get him excommunicated. Time is running out for Abbie to save her father's position and her own life as dark forces close in and the outlook for Pleasant View turns decidedly unpleasant. That is the second of the Abish Taylor Mystery series. It is called, again, Death in the Covenant. It is by D.A. Bartley, whom I'll be speaking with in a couple of minutes in this interview. The first book of the series is called A Gathering of Secrets, and this is it's a fascinating book from a mystery perspective, but also a fascinating book in terms of the history of the Mormon Church, of the Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church. You get kind of both an inside and an outside perspective because the main character, Abbie, grew up in the church and was very active in the church growing up, but has left the church. But she's gone back to Utah to be closer to her family, and there's all sorts of family dynamics and difficulties because she does live in a predominantly Mormon area, and so her having left the church causes all kinds of relationship problems. Plus, she is a female detective in a very male-oriented job, plus a very patriarchal society. So all kinds of really interesting dynamics, but also all kinds of really fascinating history, Mormon history. And we talk some about that in the interview, as I say in the interview, I have friends that I grew up with, very good friends that are Mormon, and so I know a little bit about the church, but learning more and having it couched in this novel, in this mystery, was really, really fascinating for me, and I really enjoyed reading the book, and I want to know, I definitely need to go back and read the first one, and then I want to know what happens next with Abbie and her family and all these relationships. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to the interview with D.A. Bartley. Again, the book is called Death in the Covenant, and I do have copies to give away, so stay tuned until the end of the interview to find out how to win a copy of Death in the Covenant by D.A. Bartley. And now let's go ahead and turn to that interview.
Hi, D.A. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. It's so great to be here.
I am really excited to talk to you, and we are going to talk about your book, Death in the Covenant. Before we get to the book, though, would you just share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit?
Sure. I'm a little bit of I would say orphan, but that's not quite the right word. So I've moved around a lot. I was actually born in Scotland because my dad was in graduate school at the University of Edinburgh, but we moved back to Ogden, Utah, where all of my family was when I was about 2, which is why I do not have a charming Scottish accent. We lived in Utah. I know. I wish.
Yeah.
We lived in Utah till I was about 10, and then my parents, who both were incurable travelers, decided that we should see Europe. So we lived in France for about a year and then moved to Germany, where we lived for several years, and then I moved back to Utah for high school. In terms of sort of my Mormon background, which is sort of relevant for my books, I am a member of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, which basically means that I come from a family who lived in the state of Deseret, now the state of Utah, before the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. And when I sort of have done some genealogical work, I found one side of my family actually lived in Nauvoo, Illinois, before Joseph Smith was killed in 1844. So very, very early converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then another side of my family converted in Sweden in the 1850s and traveled from Malmö to New York and then walked to Salt Lake, pushing hand carts, as you know, because I was descended from the poor people, so there wasn't, there were hand carts, no covered wagons.
That's amazing. I can't even imagine, actually.
I know. I sometimes, I've been living in New York City for the last 20 years. It's the place I've lived the longest on the planet. And every time I find myself grumbling on a cold winter's day as I have to walk 20 blocks, I'm like, okay, Allison, get a grip. This actually isn't so bad.
Right. Oh, wow. That would be an amazing trip. So thank you for that. We are going to talk about the second book of the series, but before we get to that one, let's start at the beginning and talk about the series itself. Can you give a bit of an overview of maybe the first book and the concept of the series?
Sure. It centers around a detective, Abish Taylor. She's called Abbie by most people. Her father always calls her Abish, and she grew up in Utah in a large Mormon family. And I think one of the things that I like the most about this series is, yes, there's this Mormon stuff. Yes, there's this Utah stuff that can seem very foreign and sort of different for people from the outside. But at the core, it's about family and relationships within family, intense relationships. And so some of the relationships that I like the most are Abbie and her dad and Abbie and her brother. So her father is a respected Mormon apologist, and he's the head of the Department of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University. And Abbie left for college, and then she also left the church. And this, of course, is a source of tension in her family. She didn't think she would ever come back to Utah, but her husband died unexpectedly, and she sort of feels compelled to go back and try to fix things with her family, some of her family who really don't want much to do with her anymore. And she's sort of lost a little bit. And she gets back to Utah. And in the first book, there's a rather macabre murder scene, although I'm very G-rated. So you know that it's unpleasant, but you don't really see much of it because I actually can't tolerate that sort of stuff myself. So you know what happens, but yeah. And the murder is reminiscent of a certain sort of blood atonement. So which was sort of a theory that was discussed in the Reformation period in the 1850s and 60s with Brigham Young. And I found as I was writing it that it really was kind of fun to play around with Mormon history and some of the doctrine that has been sort of forgotten and tie it into present day. So the series all takes place in current day Utah in, 2018, 2019. But the motivations for some of the murders are tied up with this sort of belief system. And I find it's actually a lot of fun for me. So the first book had blood atonement in it. The second book has another sort of very well-known aspect of Mormon history tied up in it as well. So there, I hope, does that answer your question?
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating because I'm learning a lot about, in the second book, the issue is one that's fairly, I think it may be the one thing that people think they know about the Mormon Church.
Yes.
But you get so much of the history and so much more insight as to what people, both inside and outside of the church, think about it. So I really enjoyed that. Was that your jumping off point? Sure. Was that your jumping off point for the story, or did you have another inspiration for Death in the Covenant?
For Death in the Covenant, I did have another inspiration because I didn't really imagine I would be writing this idea right now. I actually had I had another idea and it just sort of wasn't going anywhere. And I came across John, I want to say Berger, but it might be Berger's article, What Two Religions Tell Us About the Modern Dating Crisis. And he explores how shifting demographics affect both Mormon and Orthodox Jewish communities in the United States. And he sort of played off of Trinity College's American Religious Identification Survey, where they talk to people about religions in 2015. He set out the statement that for every 150 Mormon women in the state of Utah, there are 100 Mormon men. And apparently there's a similar sort of demographic imbalance among Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn. So he started looking at how these religious communities were dealing with this, because both communities are one where you're supposed to marry within the religion, right? So you don't want to have interfaith marriages. And I read the article and then I was like sent back in time to being like 9 years old in Sunday school and hearing these stories about Mormon history and going, oh my goodness, this is what I wanted to write about. And I guess that's all I can say without giving way too much away.
Right. But then there's a mystery, there's a murder, and so that kind of leads to a deeper investigation regarding the issue that you're speaking of, and it's all tied together, and Abbie has to sort through all those pieces.
Yes, she does, and she does it both. I think it's like an insider and an outsider, which is sort of an interesting place to be. I actually think it's a place where a lot of us live, quite frankly. We feel like we're part of something, but we also feel like we're not quite part of something, and that also is sort of an interesting emotional place to explore.
And I feel like this is a good time to jump in here with our first break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, DA was talking about Abbie's life as kind of both an insider and an outsider in terms of having grown up in the Mormon church, but now having left, but having come back to Utah. So all these different dynamics. And so just to catch you up and remind you what we were talking about before the break, let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
Yeah, and Abbie's also interesting because she is a woman in a male kind of dominated workplace in a very patriarchal church system. So she has a bit of an uphill battle in terms of investigating and being effective in how she investigates.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think patriarchal systems is absolutely part of her everyday life. And I think for her, not only is being a working woman a tough thing, but she's a working woman who isn't married, who doesn't have children, and doesn't go to church. And all of those things together mean that she has to deal with some difficulties. On the other hand, like, I love her partner, Jim Clark, returned missionary, nicest guy on the planet. I absolutely adore writing him. I adore thinking about how he views things. And he's just such a fundamentally good guy. And he is also in a tough position, because I feel like, in terms of, sort of an underlying patriarchal system, which is supported also by the fact that men have the priesthood and women do not have the priesthood. And so there's that underlying sort of spiritual hierarchy as well. Mm-hmm. And he's struggling with it too, and so he sometimes has to make decisions that may not go along with what the rest of the elders and the brethren would go along with. And that's also interesting, I think. And current, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I agree. I like Clark as a character. He's, you sort of slowly get to know him, but I think there's more to learn about him as the series goes on. But in terms of Abbie, what do you think, with her as the protagonist, what do you think about her will resonate with readers?
I like Abbie a lot. And I like her more every time I go back and I'm writing a new manuscript. I think of her fundamentally as that she's really tough, but then she also is always trying to do the right thing. And those two things, it's sometimes hard, because when life beats you up, and Abbie has had life sort of beat her up, and we all kind of do. There are times when you're just like, really? Can I not catch a break?
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get angry and bitter and sort of close yourself off and not try to be open-minded and open-hearted. And I think she really tries to hold on to those things, even in the face of some of adversity and challenge and loss. And that's, at her core, I think that's what I like the most about Abbie, and I think that's what makes her compelling as a character, because we want her to be tough. We want her to be able to sort of do things, but she's also vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is there a story behind her full name? Because it's a little unusual. Well, maybe for someone outside of the LDS church. I know that there's a part in the book where she's reading a story that has the name Abish in it to small children. So what's the story there?
Oh, such a good question. Thank you for asking it. I will tell you, when I started writing the very first book, I was probably 10 chapters in, and she didn't have a name. I knew what she looked like. I knew that she generally drank her coffee black in the morning. I knew all these things about her. And I didn't have a really good name. I kept on, coming back for a name, and everything seemed wrong. And then I sort of remembered that growing up in Utah, a lot of my friends who were boys were named after church leaders, prophets, and characters in the Book of Mormon. But there weren't girls with those names. And that the book that you're referring to, that came out long after I'd grown up. That's a very recent book. Okay. And so I'm like, okay, I want to take a look at what we've got in the Book of Mormon. Now, this is an interesting sort of side note. In the Book of Mormon, there are hundreds of characters that are named. Only 5 women are named. About a handful of women are named, and 2 of them are biblical characters. Abish is one of those female characters who is named, and I'm like, why did I not remember this name? This is such a perfect name. She can be Abbie. She can be Abs. And then I decided to make her a Taylor, so she is part of this sort of Mormon aristocracy. She's descended from the third prophet of the church, John Taylor, and that actually plays a role in this. He actually was a big proponent of polygamy, and I think we've been hinting around that.
Yes, we have.
and so she has this historical connection with polygamy as well. So that's her name. And as soon as I wrote it down, I was like, that is the perfect name. So I actually really love it.
Yeah, absolutely. What kind of research did you do for the book?
Now that I live in a place where church is not the central part of everybody's life, I sort of have forgotten how much time you spend learning religion. So when I was growing up, we spent 3 hours at church on Sunday. We generally had church-related activities all during the week. And then in high school, I did early morning seminary. So before school started, I would get up at 6:15 probably. Mm-hmm. And, no, I was at school at 6:15, so I was awake before then. I blocked that from my memory.
Sure.
And so I've spent a lot of time studying religion and doctrine and scriptures of the Mormon Church. Now, having said that, I'm extraordinarily skeptical of my own memories, and I doubt everything. So I always go back when it comes to sort of the factual things, because I think it's important for me, and I think for readers too, to sort of trust that when you're reading something that is fiction, but there are references to sort of factual things, that those facts are right. So I really do my best to make sure that all of that is correct. And I don't know if you know, like I'm a lawyer and an academic by training, have a PhD in political science, and I went to law school. And so I do love to research, and getting the facts right kind of matters to me personally. So I am always skeptical of my memories of times when I was, 8 and 12 and whatever. I'm like, okay, am I remembering this correctly? So that's where the research starts, is pretty much from my memories.
Okay. Well, and I think it's important to have things factual, because I think there's so many misconceptions and misunderstandings about the Mormon Church. People think maybe they know what it's about, but they don't really. And so to be able to read this and learn more and understand more of some of those doctrines and what actual churchgoers believe in and understand, I think that's really, really helpful.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. I mean, I clearly am, it's one perspective, but I agree with you. I personally love to read fiction that takes place in an environment and a world that I don't necessarily know well, and I love learning about the world that way. So I'm assuming that I hope there are other people who feel the same way.
Mm-hmm. I think there are. I had two of my very best friends in high school were actually Mormon, and their dad was the president of the stake in my tiny, tiny hometown. So, like, some of this is familiar, but we kind of had a mutual, we don't talk about religion in our friendship. And I actually dated the brother in that relationship, in that family for a while. But so I feel like I have a better understanding of the LDS Church, but still, that it's good to get a different perspective on what I learned from them and their family.
Yeah, undoubtedly, I'm sure you do. And if you are good friends with, even if you say you're not going to talk about religion is generally really central to active Mormon lives.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I actually love that your friends were like, we care about our friendship, and let's not let the fact that we have different belief systems interfere with us being human beings. I mean, that right. Actually, I think, that's what I would love our whole society to sort of be more like that.
Yeah. And, I didn't have a problem, I would pray with them in the evenings when they would do their evening prayer, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But like the Mormon elders lived in their basement, they had the basement apartment. And,
missionaries? That's so funny.
Yeah. And it was like, you don't really need to go talk to them. They're fine.
Oh, that's good. So you weren't like on an investigator list where they were like, here, we'll talk to you about the Mormon Church. Would you like a Book of Mormon?
No. I talked to them plenty at the house, so they never really came to our house.
That's really nice.
was fascinating. We're still friends now, but I did enjoy reading this book and being like, oh, okay, I kind of understand that, and now I understand it better.
Oh, that's great.
So in terms of some of the history and the doctrine, how do you decide what to include? I mean, it's very central because of Abbie's family, but how do you decide how much to include and how to walk that line between, making it part of her life and maybe too much?
Okay. Actually, I wish I could say that I was really good at this, and I think I can say I'm unequivocally terrible at it because, happily, I have a really good editor. So in this particular book, I sort of fell down this rabbit hole and was obsessed with the case law on polygamy. So the Mormon Church brought a number of cases, a lot of cases, to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 19th century, and I was sort of obsessed with it. And my editor was like going, yeah, not so much. So when I go astray, I have somebody who'll go back and say, okay, let's just have a hint of this. We don't need to go into that. And quite frankly, that is completely correct, because what matters most is the story. So I think as I'm writing more, like this is now the second book and I'm working on the third, I'm learning, I hope, to approach it in a way that gives you enough understanding for a reader to sort of understand the motivations and what's going on for the primary story, which really is the mystery, right? It's the puzzle. It's who did what and why, who done it. And so I do try to follow the story, and the story does lead inevitably to some of these, these questions that deal with belief systems. But then to pull it back, because if you wanted to read a nonfiction book on whatever the doctrine of scriptures, you'd pick that up. So I try to sort of not go too far in depth, but just enough, and just enough so that somebody who's unfamiliar with it can understand what's going on. And that their eyes don't start to glaze over.
Right. That reminds me of the scene where the lawyer comes in and he's going to tell them this whole spiel about all of these cases, and they're like, "Thank you, goodbye."
I know. Actually, I loved writing that scene because I used to practice law, and I remember I was sort of relieved. Where I'm like, "Oh, actually, I don't need to listen to this whole thing. I'm going to actually shut him up and kick him out of the room."
Nice. How is it for you writing this book? Because you and Abbie are a little similar in that, you grew up in the church, but you're not there now. Is it ever a little strange for you to immerse yourself in this world for writing?
I like to go back and think about the things and have a little bit of distance. Abbie is in it, and it's fun to see how she deals with being in Utah and not part of the religion, but we're not the same person. And I wish I were more like Abbie. The one thing that I do think that I share with Abbie that is sort of very similar is we both have very close relationships with our brothers. And that's one of the things as I was writing the sort of the end of the first book, and it's definitely here in the second book, is that relationship with her. There's one brother she's very close with. The rest of her siblings sort of have stepped away as she's left the church. And I only have one brother. I don't come from a big Mormon family. And my brother is younger than I am, and Abbie's brother is older. But I find when I'm writing that's where I think I connect with Abbie the most, is that her relationship with her brother is very similar to my relationship with my brother. I actually talk to him pretty much every single day. And he was living in California, now he's living in Utah. And we're really close, and that's the one thing, I guess, where I feel I share the most with Abbie. And then I also share with her the fact that we both like to cook. Mm-hmm. Although she doesn't have as much time to cook as I do.
Right. Well, especially in this book, I don't think she cooks at all, hardly.
Yeah, she feels bad because her brother cooks for her. I think that's right.
Yeah. Her brother cooks and Flynn cooks, and I'm not sure Abbie cooks.
I think she's tired in this book. She does in the first book. You're right. She's tired.
She is tired.
I don't have insomnia like Abbie does, but I am also tired. So let's take a break. Let's let's take a 30-second break and I'll take a quick nap. Not really. But let's take that second break of the podcast. And when we come back, we'll have the conclusion to the interview with D.A. Bartley about her new book, Death in the Covenant. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to this next segment because if you're wondering why I sound, even more awkward than I usually do starting a sentence, it's because I had to edit out me completely losing my train of thought. I couldn't think of what I was going to ask, and then it came to me, and then I sort of just launched into it in mid-thought / mid-sentence. So more insight probably than you needed into my interviewing techniques, but there you have it.
Do you have an extended family, and what do they think of the book?
I do have, almost all of my family lives in Utah. And everybody has been supportive, which has been really nice. I was a little worried about it before the first book came out, and I sort of reached out to everybody and said, hey, I love you all, and I know you all are want to be supportive, but don't feel like you have to buy the book, read the book, or like the book. It's okay. Mm-hmm. And it's been actually much easier than I had expected. So that's been really nice. My close family, of course, like my father is my biggest cheerleader. So I suspect that no matter what I would write, he would buy 6 copies and say, "Oh, this is wonderful." And then my brother is, of course, also really, really supportive. So and my mother has passed away. So my close family is actually very small. But my cousins have all been, all really wonderful. And yes, I do have a big extended Mormon family. I know when my daughter was born, she was great-grandchild number 23.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are, and everyone's just been wonderful. So, that speaks a lot about, that speaks well of just how supportive people can be. And I guess actually, if we come back around, it sort of gets back to your friendship with your friends who had a different belief system, and you're like, okay, that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The same sort of thing. It's nice.
It is, yeah. In terms of the series, do you have kind of an overall arc that you envision, or are you just going to write as long as Abbie is speaking to you?
I would like to write as long as Abbie is speaking to me. I will say, however, that there's an arc that goes from the first to the third, that there are certain characters where things are a little bit messy after the first, a little bit messy after the second, and there are some people who may redeem themselves, some people who may not, and some sort of stories that will be tied up at the end of the third, which I think will be interesting because that will leave me from then on to sort of explore some different themes with some different characters. I mean, Jim Clark I want to stay with I love him. And so I can't imagine that he and Abbie could be apart. But there are some other characters who I think are really important that might find some ends of their storylines in the third book and then go on from there for as long as readers want to read about Abbie.
Great. Thank you. And I know you said you're working on the third book. Do you have a time frame for when that one might come out?
That is with my agent and publisher right now, so that decision is not in my head. That is a decision above my pay grade.
Sure. Okay. Not a problem. You're working on. You're like, we're talking about the second one. Geez, just hang in there. Slow down.
Exactly.
So you have a PhD. You're a lawyer by trade. When did you decide that you wanted to start writing fiction? Is it something that you've always wanted to do, or did it come later in life?
I'm a super duper late bloomer. and in fact, this is a really good question. It's a little bit of a hard question for me to answer because, and I guess I'll just say up front, it's sort of, I like to think of it as a series of unfortunate events that led me to this. I have always been a mystery reader. Like my grandma, my mom, and I would read mysteries. They both introduced me to Agatha Christie. I think that Agatha Christie was my first grown-up book that I ever read. Like, I don't know. We all have those books like when we're 10 and 11 that are the grown-up books. And for me, it was Agatha Christie. So I devour those classic mysteries. That's my happy place. Like reading P.D. James for, an entire weekend, just snuggle on the couch is like my idea of heaven. But I never thought really ever that I would write fiction. And then my mother had Alzheimer's for about 10 years before she passed away. And in the last several years of her life, I was flying back to Utah really as much as I could. My dad was taking care of her largely on his own. And it was hard. And on one of those trips, I went to visit a friend of mine who had moved up to Ogden, actually up to Pleasant View. And we went for a walk around her neighborhood, and that's where I saw the house, which in the first book is where the first body is discovered in this house. I got back to New York. I really sort of didn't think about it. I got back to New York, and I just I might have been reading a P.D. James at the time. I had this house in my head. And I came back from a run along the East River, and I sat down to my computer, and I started writing, which was really weird. I had never written fiction before, never thought about writing fiction before. I wrote things that tended to put people to sleep. Legal documents and academic documents. Like, really,
right,
who wants to do that? So I wrote about 7 chapters and then sort of put it away. And a few days later, this is the second unfortunate event, my daughter got a concussion playing lacrosse. And at the time, the medical advice was she should be in a dark room, couldn't read, couldn't look at a screen, couldn't do anything. So basically, a really bad space for a teenage girl to be in.
Yeah.
And so I'd gotten her some audiobooks, and she complained that she didn't like the voices. And so she asked me, she says, "Well, what are you writing, Mom?" And I told her, and she said, well, read it to me. So I read as much as I'd written, and she said, well, what happens next? And I looked at her and said, I don't know. And she said, well, go write more. So for the course of about the next 2 weeks, while she napped, I would write. And then when she woke up, I would read to her, and then she'd nap, and I'd write. And after she was better and was back at school, and she is perfectly healthy, she's a happy sophomore in college right now, brain functioning perfectly well, I was halfway through what was supposed to be, what became the first book. And so I was just like, well, I might as well finish this and see where it goes. And that's actually how it all started for me. And now that I'm in it, I can't imagine not being in it. It's such a strange, obvious thing to be doing, but I really hadn't thought about becoming a writer until I was in my early 40s, mid-40s.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that story, though, because, how many teenagers want their mom to read to them, especially what they've been writing.
I'd never thought about that. You're right. I guess that is actually really sweet.
It's really awesome. I mean, that maybe there are more out there than I can imagine, but I just picture a lot of eye rolling usually.
Oh, I love that. I'd never thought about it that way. That's so nice. Thank you.
Yeah. So do you then, from your experience of coming to this, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Take it with a grain of salt, because what do I know? But I think the more voices we have out there, the better. And however that is. So I think persistence, and I'll say this, just keep on writing and know that it's all sort of a learning experience. I wrote the manuscript, the first manuscript that I thought was done. And it was completely not. and that's okay. Like, I ended up cutting the first 4 chapters, which basically I wrote just for me, and now I know pretty much a lot of writers, first-time writers, do that sort of thing. Just keep at it, because there's something there. If you feel like there's a story there, it's good to get it out. And so I think do it. And then find your tribe. Find a place where there are people to support you. There are so many great writing organizations out there. I mean, in the suspense genre, you have Mystery Writers of America, you have Sisters in Crime. It's, there's a lot of stuff out there. And I know I have friends who write middle grade stuff. I have friends who write romance, friends who write fantasy. There are groups out there. Find them, because it is a solitary activity, and that's probably why a lot of people are drawn to it. It's really wonderful to live in that world, but sometimes it's nice to have some friends. And so keep at it, and then find your friends. Find the people that will be there to help you along, who are at different points along the writing journey, and stick there. Stick with it, with your group.
Mm-hmm. Nice, thank you. I know that you obviously love Agatha Christie, P.D. James. Do you have other favorite authors or genres when you read?
Oh, okay. I have lately been reading memoirs, which is so funny, because if you'd asked me 6 months ago, do you like memoirs? I'd say, I don't really read memoirs. And then I realized I read both Educated and Shrill back to back. And I'm like, okay, clearly I'm doing some memoirs. And then I have a friend, Evie Minieri, who writes fantasy, and I had never thought about reading fantasy. And because she's written it, I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to read this. I am pretty eclectic, I guess, when I'm not in my happy space. Like, I will always come back to mystery and suspense, just because I think that's how my mind works. But I am enjoying reading some different things too. And I think it's sort of, for now that I'm a writer as well as a reader, it's wonderful to see how other people deal with the same problems and challenges that I have, and go, oh my goodness, that's so amazing. And I do still have like lots of actual hardcover books as I'm looking at my shelves of my suspense stuff. I like to read across the board, I guess.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. And where can people find you? Do you have a website? Where can they find you on social media? Fill us in on all that good stuff.
Okay. dabartley.com is the website. I am on Facebook as D.A. Bartley Author, and also on Twitter. I try to stay up with it. I do find that being on social media all the time is not sort of particularly healthy for my sort of outlook on life, and so I dip in periodically. I think I've pulled back a little bit in recent months, but I do stay on there because it is a lovely way to communicate and to sort of be out there in the world, particularly if I'm not there all the time. And I love to hear from readers. So absolutely reach out to me. I may not be right there on that given moment, but I do try to check in every day for some period of time. I don't know what everyone else is doing with social media these days. It seems like everybody is sort of reconsidering it a little bit.
Right.
And maybe I'm in that space right now too, so reconsidering exactly how I interact and trying to sort of really be positive. And I love that. In fact, I had a reader post, and I love this, a reader post on my Facebook page that my publicist had put out a picture of the cover of Death in the Covenant, and the background looked like it was from the West, but it actually wasn't. It was actually in Australia. And this reader was like, this doesn't look like it's in Utah. And I'm like, oh my goodness, thank you so much for this catch. And then we all went back and it all got changed. And I was like, thank you. And then she wrote back, and she's with a smiley face, oh, so good. And I was like, see, we can all actually be kind to each other in this environment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Wouldn't that be nice if that were the norm?
One can dream.
Yes. Well, we have talked about a lot of different topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like for people to know about this series, or about Death in the Covenant specifically? Anything that we haven't covered on writing or this series?
Oh, Sarah, this has been so delightful. I think we've covered so much. I would add, I hope that my stories sort of inspire readers to think about what we choose to believe and how that can impact our lives. Because I really sort of think that I certainly believe this, that what I think and what my intent affect my actions and how I perceive the world and how I engage with the world. And I think that that's sort of an important thing to be mindful of. So I guess that would be the only thing that I would add.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I really enjoyed speaking with you and enjoyed the book. Can't wait for the rest of the series.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. This has just been such a delightful way to start my day talking to you.
Nice. Thank you. That's much better than what you could have said.
I do like when an interview can end on some laughter and, a positive note. So I'm thankful that I was not an unpleasant way to start the day. Thank you so much to D.A. Bartley for taking the time out of her last weekend to talk to me and for being flexible about time because I was trying to fit in things between family engagements. So she was awesome in that way. She was awesome to chat with. I so enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did as well. I hope that you will check out the book. It is called Death in the Covenant. It is a really good read, very intense, very informative, very just an enjoyable book for a mystery, not like overly scary, but intense and suspenseful. So if you're into mysteries that don't scare the pants off you, this is a really good one, which I tend to be somewhat of a wimp, as you know. If you would like to maybe win a copy of Death in the Covenant, you just have to go to our social media pages, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on the post with this episode. Comment on the post this episode. It's episode 176, interview with D.A. Bartley. Again, that is GSMC Book Review, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and comment on this post. You'll be automatically entered to win a copy of Death in the Covenant by D.A. Bartley. If you're a fan of mysteries, you should definitely check that out and see about winning a copy of that book. Thank you once again to D.A. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I hope you have had a wonderful week. My apologies for getting this interview out a day or so late. I've traveled and then had jet lag, and I was trying to fit everything in, and so I'm a little later than I normally am, for which I apologize. But thank you, as always, for listening, for tuning in, for supporting the podcast, for supporting authors, and being lovers of books. I can't thank you enough for that. Hope you have tomorrow's Friday, so I hope you have a wonderful 3-day weekend if you get one, and hopefully during part of that weekend you'll be able to find some time to go get lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.